In the winter of 2017, every kitchen table in Holt County, Nebraska, was telling the same story about young people who wanted in. The story changed depending on whether the speaker was a father, an uncle, a banker, or one of the polite older neighbors who had spent a lifetime listening to ambition explain itself across the leaves of a family farm. At the supper table it sounded like patience. At the bank it sounded like staged risk. At the coffee shop it sounded like benevolent skepticism. But it was the same story all the way through. If a young person wanted to start farming, the first thing the family asked them to do was prove they were not running on dreams. The second thing was to show that they had numbers. The third was to wait their turn. The fourth, almost always implied even when nobody said it aloud, was that real entry into farming would happen when the older generation either felt ready to let some weight fall off their shoulders or could no longer carry it without bruising. None of those conditions were unreasonable. They were the rules under which a great deal of rural America had quietly transferred itself from one generation to the next for more than a century. But the rules had a habit of working in favor of sons. They did not always know what to do with daughters. The daughter at the center of this story was named Hannah Whitley, though most of the family called her Hen, a nickname her grandfather had given her when she was 4 and could already identify, by sound alone, which tractor was running in the home place yard. Hannah was 26 in 2017, with a long-boned frame, hair the color of late wheat, and a habit of listening longer than people expected. She had gone away to school at the Agricultural College in Lincoln, finished with honors in agronomy and a minor in farm finance, then worked for 3 years as a field agronomist at a regional firm before coming back to Holt County, not in defeat or sentiment, but with a plan she had been quietly refining for almost 5 years. The plan involved a small but specific request. She wanted to take responsibility for 30 acres of the family operation, on her own terms, with her own crop plan, and run them for 3 full seasons as a proof of method. She did not want a gift. She did not want a wage. She wanted access. Access to soil, weather, a planter pass, and the right to be measured by what came out of the ground at the end of each year. The family operation, run by her father Carl and her uncle Dean, was respectable by Holt County standards. They farmed corn, soybeans, alfalfa, and ran a modest cow-calf herd on broken pasture ground that had been in the family since before Hannah was born. Carl was practical and largely fair-minded. Dean was sharper, both in tongue and in instinct, and made most of the operational decisions on planting depth, hybrid selection, fertility timing, and equipment rotation. Hannah's mother, Linda, handled the books with quiet precision and had been the silent power behind several family decisions that everybody else later took credit for. Hannah's older brother, Curtis, was 31, married, and had been formally in the operation for almost a decade. He ran most of the day-to-day field work. He drove the combine. He had recently been added as a junior partner. The path from son to partner had been laid out in the calm way these things often are, with no need for confrontation or speeches. Everyone simply understood what it meant. What no one had clearly understood, until Hannah came back home, was what it would mean for her. The conversation that became the first real meeting on her request happened on a Saturday in February at her parents' house. It was scheduled, in the polite way family meetings get scheduled when nobody wants to call them meetings. Carl was there. Dean was there. Linda was there. Curtis came in last, after stomping snow off his boots in the entryway. Coffee was made. The kitchen smelled like burnt toast and woodstove heat. Hannah sat at the kitchen table with a thin manila folder in front of her. She did not open it right away. She knew enough about this family to understand that pulling out a folder in the first 10 minutes would be read as either pressure or pretension, and either reading would cost her ground she could not afford to give up before the conversation had even begun. She let them ease in. Weather, market talk, who was buying what at the Atkinson sale barn, a story Dean told about a heifer that had figured out how to lift a gate latch. Then, when the small talk began to settle into the kind of pause that signals a real subject is waiting in the room, she said, quietly, "I'd like to talk about the 30 acres. Everyone heard her. They had all known what the meeting was actually about. Carl nodded slowly. Dean folded his arms in the way men fold their arms when they are politely settling in for a discussion they have already decided not to be persuaded by. Curtis looked at the floor. Linda did not move at all, which Hannah took, correctly, as the most attentive listening in the room. Carl said, "Tell us what you've got in mind, Hen." Hannah took a slow breath and laid it out. She wanted to take over management of one specific block of ground, the 30-acre piece they called the South Rectangle that sat just east of the home place. It was a workable but historically inconsistent piece, with two distinct soil types, a slight ridge on the west side, and a small lower draw on the east that tended to hold moisture in wet years and bake in dry ones. The family had farmed it conventionally for years and had treated it, by Dean's own description in past conversations, as a piece that always carried the rest of the corn ground's averages downward. It was a sensible field for her request because it was small enough that the family could spare it, problematic enough that her success would mean something, and contained enough that she could manage it largely on her own with the existing equipment. What she wanted, she said, was 3 years of full management authority on that piece. She would choose the rotation, the hybrid and variety, the population, the planting depth, the fertility plan, the residue strategy, and the timing of operations. She would coordinate with the operation schedule for planter and combine use, paying a fair custom rate for the actual passes. She would be financially responsible for her own inputs, taking out her own small operating note from the bank in Atkinson. She would carry her own crop insurance on those acres. At the end of each year, the production from those 30 acres would be hers to market and account for separately. She would pay rent. She named the rate. It was the rate the operation had been quietly considering for cash renting that piece if it ever decided to do so to an outside renter. She did not ask for any favors. She did not ask for help with cash flow. She did not ask for forgiveness of any kind. What she asked for was access to land and equipment under transparent commercial terms, and the right to be measured at the end of 3 years by the actual production and economic outcomes on those 30 acres. The kitchen was quiet for a moment when she finished. Then Dean leaned back in his chair and smiled. It was not a cruel smile. Dean was not a cruel man. But it was the kind of smile that older men sometimes use without realizing how completely it functions as a wall. He said, 30 acres. Hannah said, yes. He said, and you're going to plant it, fertilize it, market it. Yes. He looked at Carl. He looked at Curtis. He looked back at Hannah, still smiling that wall of a smile, and he said, honey, that's a lot of words for 30 acres. Curtis half laughed under his breath, looked immediately at his mother, saw nothing on her face, and looked back down at the floor. Hannah did not flinch. She had known this moment was coming. She had even rehearsed for it, in the careful private way young people rehearse for the moments they suspect their families are not going to give them. She said, evenly, it's 30 acres because that's what I can handle without disrupting the operation. It's 30 acres because that's big enough to actually test what I want to test and small enough that, if it doesn't work, none of you will lose anything you can't replace next year. Carl, gentler than his brother, said, what is it you want to test? That was the question Hannah had been waiting for. She opened the folder. Inside were 3 years of soil tests from the South Rectangle, gathered by zone and depth, that she had personally pulled the previous fall after asking permission to take samples. There were yield maps from the operations monitor covering the last 5 seasons, broken down into zone-level production averages with a clarity the family had never bothered to extract. There was a budgeted operating plan for the proposed 3 years, including expected variable costs, conservative yield assumptions, marketing scenarios, a sensitivity analysis at 3 different commodity price levels, and a fully calculated break-even per acre under each scenario. There was a rotation plan that included a year of corn with a deliberate cover crop strategy, followed by soybeans with a managed companion system on the lower draw, followed by either corn again or a small grain depending on conditions and observed soil response. There was a fertility plan that worked from her existing soil tests and proposed targeted variable rate phosphorus and potassium based on zone, alongside a nitrogen plan that included split applications and a planned reduction of total nitrogen units in year 3 if her cover crop and residue strategy produced the carry she expected. There was a tillage plan, which was largely no plan in the traditional sense, with one shallow vertical pass before corn and minimal disturbance otherwise. There was a residue management plan. There was a weed management plan that did not rely on assumptions Hannah considered fragile. There was a documented contingency strategy for an unusually wet spring and for an unusually dry July. And on the last page, in a single clean table, there were the numbers. She set the folder on the table and turned it so the others could see. She did not push it toward them. She just turned it. "This is what I've been working on," she said. "For the last 4 years. I'd like you to look at it. Not the whole thing right now. Just the last page." The last page had 4 columns. The first column showed the operation's actual 5-year average yields on the south rectangle. The second column showed her conservative projected yields based on her rotation and management plan, with the same input price assumptions Linda had been using in the family's own budgets. The third column showed projected per acre net return at 3 commodity price scenarios. The fourth column showed something she had been most careful about. It was the projected effect, over 3 years, on soil organic matter, infiltration response time, and a few other measurable physical indicators on the south rectangle, drawn from peer-reviewed work she had cited in a brief appendix at the back of the folder. The numbers were not boastful. That was the most important thing about them. Hannah had been disciplined enough not to inflate. The yield projections were within range of what the operation already achieved on its better acres, with realistic gains on the lower draw and the ridge. The economic projections, even at the lowest of the 3 commodity prices she had modeled, showed her covering her operating note, paying the proposed rent in full, paying the custom rates for planter and combine passes, and ending each of the 3 years with a modest but real positive cash position. At the middle and higher commodity prices, the returns were significantly stronger. And in every scenario, she had included a column showing what the same field would likely return under the existing management approach. Her numbers, at every price point, came in higher. There was silence in the kitchen for several seconds. Carl reached for the folder first. He pulled it toward him slowly. He looked at the last page. He read the columns. He glanced up at Hannah once, then back down at the page. He flipped slowly to the soil test summaries. Then to the yield zone analysis. Then to the rotation plan. Then to the budget. Dean uncrossed his arms. Curtis stopped looking at the floor. Linda, who had not moved, finally moved. She reached over, slid the folder gently from Carl when he was ready to pass it, and read with the same calm intensity she gave to every set of numbers that mattered in their lives. Hannah waited. She did not fill the silence. That was something she had learned from her grandfather, who had been gone 6 years and was still teaching her things in retrospect. He had told her once, on a quiet afternoon when she was 15 and they were sitting on the back step looking out at a freshly cut hay field, that the most powerful thing in any negotiation was the willingness to let a number sit there without explaining it. Numbers, he had said, are stronger when they are not defended. He had said it once and never again, and she had remembered it ever since. Dean was the first to speak. He was used to being the first to speak. He pulled the folder, when it was passed to him, with a movement that was slower than usual. He read the last page. He read the rotation plan. He read the fertility plan. He turned the folder a little to look at the zone-level yield maps. He took longer than he usually took to form a sentence. He said, "Where did you get these maps?" Hannah said, "From the monitor. I asked Curtis last year if I could pull the data." Dean looked at Curtis. Curtis nodded. She asked. I said yes. I figured she wanted to look at them. Dean nodded slowly. He looked at the yield maps again. He had seen the raw maps before. Every operator had. But he had not seen them broken down with this much clarity by zone over 5 years, organized in a way that made the South Rectangle's underperformance against its own better areas almost embarrassingly visible. He said, "This piece has been pulling our average down." Hannah said, "Yes." He said, "We knew it." Hannah said, "I know." There was another silence, shorter this time. Dean looked at the budget pages. He looked at the cost assumptions. He read the rent figure. He read the custom rate Hannah had proposed paying for planter and combine passes. He read the operating note projections, the insurance assumptions, the marketing plan. He looked, last, at the line that showed Hannah's projected return per acre under her management at each commodity price scenario, compared to the family's existing approach. He said, slowly, "Where did you get the cover crop numbers?" Hannah said, 2 years of trial work from the university, 2 years of producer data from the lower Niobrara region, and 1 growing season of soil response data from a field I helped scout up by O'Neill. I weighted them by similarity to our soil profile. The conservative range I used in the budget is the lower end of what any of those datasets reported, not the average. Dean nodded. He nodded again, more slowly. He set the folder down. He looked at Carl. He looked at Linda. Then he looked back at Hannah. He said, "Hen, why didn't you just bring this to us a year ago?" Hannah said, "Because a year ago I didn't have 3 years of soil tests, I didn't have the zone-level yield analysis, and I hadn't finished the budgeting at the 3rd price point. I wanted to bring it when I could defend every line." She paused, and then added, with no edge in her voice but with no softness either, "And because the last time I brought you something like this, 3 years ago, you smiled and said it was a lot of words for not a lot of acres." The room went very still. Dean looked at her. He did not contradict her. He could not contradict her. He remembered the conversation. He had not even thought about it again after that day. He looked down at the folder. He said, "I don't remember that." Hannah said, kindly, "I know." That sentence almost broke the room. It did not, because Hannah did not let it. She moved the conversation forward with the steady professionalism she had brought into the kitchen from the start. She said, "I'm not bringing this to argue about anything that happened before. I'm bringing it because I think it's ready, and I think it's honest, and I think you'll see that the operation has more to gain from running this experiment on 30 acres than it has to lose. If I'm wrong, the data we get will still be useful to all of us. If I'm right, you'll have a younger operator in the family who has proven her work and earned a real place in the next set of conversations about the future of this farm." Carl reached for the folder again. He flipped to the page that showed the rent figure she had proposed paying. He looked at it for a long moment. He said, "You're going to pay full rent?" Hannah said, "Yes." He said, "At market rate?" "Yes." He said, "And you're going to take out your own operating note?" "Yes." He said, "In your own name, with your own credit?" "Yes." "I've already had a preliminary conversation with Becky at the bank in Atkinson. If you decide to lease me those acres," she said, "the rest of the application is straightforward." Carl breathed out slowly. He set the folder down. He looked at Dean. He looked at Curtis. He looked at Linda. He looked at Hannah. He said, "Hen, why did you bring rent into this?" Hannah said, "Because I'm not asking for a favor. I'm asking for a contract. If it's a contract, then it's real, and the results matter the same way they would matter for any other tenant. Favors get forgotten when someone retires. Contracts get remembered. I want to be remembered." Linda, who had said nothing the entire meeting, finally spoke. She said, very quietly, "You should have always been remembered, Hen." The kitchen was silent again. Curtis, who had grown more uncomfortable than anyone in the room and to his credit was honest enough to know it, cleared his throat and said, "I've been here a long time and I never put together a folder like this." Hannah looked at him. She did not say anything cutting. She had no interest in cutting her brother down. She loved Curtis. She had ridden in the combine cab with him when she was 8 years old and he was 13, and she still remembered the way he had let her sit in his lap and turn the steering wheel through a long straight stretch on a fall afternoon. She said, gently, "You didn't have to, Kurt. You came in through a different door." He nodded, slowly. He said, "Yeah. I guess I did." The decision did not happen that day. The Whitleys were not a family that decided important things in one sitting. But the decision happened. 2 weeks later, after Carl and Dean had each read the folder twice on their own time, and after Linda had quietly run the numbers through her own budget software at the kitchen table on a Sunday evening, the family met again. This time Carl did most of the talking. He told Hannah they accepted her proposal. They would lease her the south rectangle for 3 years at the market rent she had named. They would charge her the custom rates she had proposed for the planter and combine passes. She would take out her own operating note in her own name. She would carry her own crop insurance. At the end of each year, the production from those acres would be hers to account for and market separately. They would not interfere with her management decisions. Dean would be available for advice if she asked for it. He would not give it unless she did. Carl said, when the formal acceptance was done, "Hen, I'm sorry it took this long to listen to you properly." Hannah said, "Thank you, Dad." That was all that was said. The next 3 years are their own story, and only the bones of it belong here. She did exactly what she said she would do. She planted the south rectangle in year 1 with a corn rotation and a managed cover crop strategy that the county at first quietly mocked and then, as the field came up evenly across the ridge and the draw both, began to discuss without quite admitting they were discussing it. She managed fertility with the variable rate plan she had outlined. She handled her own crop insurance paperwork. She paid her rent on time. She paid the custom rates on time. She marketed her own corn at the elevator under her own name and her own truck tag, which became its own quiet milestone in the county. In year 1 her yield came in above the family's 5-year average on that piece, modestly but unmistakably. The draw, in particular, performed better than it ever had. In year 2 she planted soybeans with her companion system and brought in a yield that, even at the conservative price scenario she had budgeted for, paid her note, her rent, and her custom rates and left her with positive cash. In year 3 she rotated back to corn, ran her reduced nitrogen plan based on the residue and cover she had built, and brought in a corn crop that exceeded her own projections. Her soil test results, taken on the same flagged zones each fall, moved in the directions she had predicted. Organic matter rose. Infiltration response improved. Compaction indicators improved. None of it was miraculous. All of it was measurable. By the end of year 2, the family had begun to ask her quietly for advice on other pieces of ground. By the end of year 3, Dean himself, who had once smiled at her 30-acre request with the kind of smile that was a wall, was sitting at her kitchen table looking at proposed fertility plans for a quarter section across the gravel road and listening to her in a way he had never listened to her before. The county talked about it less than the family did, because the county is slower than families to acknowledge change in the agricultural balance of authority. But the county talked about it enough. The most important moment, in some ways, did not come from yields or from soil tests at all. It came in the summer of year 2, when Hannah was at the elevator in Atkinson dropping off a load of soybeans from the south rectangle. The elevator manager, a man named Phil Holcomb who had known her father for 30 years, looked up at her from the office window as the ticket was being printed and said, in his dry, careful way, "Whose truck is that, Hen?" Hannah said, "Mine." He said, "And whose beans?" Hannah said, "Mine." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he gave her the particular nod he reserved for people he considered serious. He said, "All right, then. Welcome to the line." That was, in many ways, the moment her presence in Holt County agriculture became real to people outside her family. The elevator's line. Her own truck. Her own crop. Her own ticket. What had begun in the family kitchen 4 years earlier, with a thin manila folder and a question that had at first been received with a smile that meant no, had moved through 3 years of disciplined work and was now a place she stood on her own. In year 4 the family expanded her lease to 160 acres. By year 6 she was leasing a full quarter from outside the family in addition to the family ground, on the strength of her records and her reputation. By year 8 she had bought her first 80 acres on her own credit, with the bank in Atkinson treating her as the kind of customer they did not need to second-guess. Curtis, to his real credit, supported her every step of the way once the kitchen meeting had recalibrated something in him that he had not even known needed recalibrating. The brother and sister did not become identical operators, but they became reliable partners. Carl and Dean both lived long enough to see Hannah established. Dean once said, at a family Thanksgiving when Hannah was 34, in front of a table of in-laws and grandchildren, that the smartest thing he had ever done in farming was sign that first 30-acre lease and that the second smartest thing he had ever done was shut up after he signed it. Everyone laughed. Hannah did not laugh. She only looked at her uncle for a moment and nodded once, and Dean nodded back, and the table moved on. There is a phrase that older farmers in that part of Nebraska sometimes use when they talk about a person who has earned their place. They say of that person that they came in straight. It is not a phrase that has any clear origin or rule attached to it. It means, in the rural shorthand of that country, that they entered the work without trying to bend the rules around them, that they accepted the terms of the work the same way they would have asked anyone else to accept them, and that they let their numbers speak before they let their grievances speak. It is a phrase often applied to sons and rarely applied to daughters. By her late 30s, Hannah Whitley was someone of whom even the older men in the Atkinson coffee shop, the ones who had once smiled at her grandfather's nickname for her, would say, without thinking twice about it, that she came in straight. That, in its own quiet way, was the largest result of the kitchen meeting in 2017. She had walked into a room that fully expected to politely dilute her ambition into something small enough for her family to keep underestimating, and she had set on the table a folder so carefully built that there was no honest way to dilute her further without admitting that the dilution had never been about the work. The numbers had shut the room down because the numbers were unanswerable. She had not bullied anyone. She had not pleaded. She had not played on family loyalty or on gender or on grievance. She had asked, in clear, specific, business-like language, to be given access to 30 acres under the same terms any serious tenant would be offered, and she had brought with her the kind of preparation that no serious family could refuse without revealing more about themselves than they wanted to reveal. The smile around the table in the first 10 minutes of that meeting was real, but it belonged to a story about young women in farming families that her family did not yet know was already ending. By the time Dean uncrossed his arms and Carl reached for the folder a second time, the story had begun to change in that kitchen, and through that kitchen, in slow ripples, in that county. She asked for 30 acres and they smiled. Then her numbers shut the room down. And year by year, ticket by ticket, soil test by soil test, contract by contract, the room that had once smiled at her came to understand that what had walked in that day, in a young woman's steady voice and a thin manila folder, was not a request to be tolerated but the next generation of the farm.